The house on Maple Row carried winter in its walls, orange peels simmering on the stove, a resin breath of cedar, the faint bite of cold that clung to coats in the entry. Voices braided together from the dining room, bright overlapping the kind of happiness people produce when they believe the scene has been fully cast and the curtain already up. I stood on the threshold with a small parcel in my hands, brown craft paper thin linen twine and knot. I had tightened twice so it wouldn't loosen on the drive. The dining table stretched the length of the room like a polished skating rink. Crystal stems thin as wrists, narrow candles, place cards in tidy navy ink each loop and serif careful enough to pass inspection. I read every card. I read them again. Marin was not there. At the head of the table sat my son Evan, a posture inherited from his father, the square of the shoulders, the jaw set, as if even the ham required management. He pressed his knife through the glaze as though carving were an office he'd been elected to. When I drew breath to offer a greeting, he did not look up. "Your plate is on the porch," he said, tone gentle enough to pretend humor and precise enough to be anything but. Forks hovered. The room's chatter clicked shut like a pocket watch. Across from him, Laurel, the silk scarf at her throat, the exact moss green of the one that used to live at the back of my own closet, smoothed the hem of her dress and let her eyes rest past me as if I'd wandered in from the sidewalk by mistake. Heat climbed my neck. I crossed to the table because retreat would have turned the air mean. I set the parcel not large, no heavier than a book, beside the platter of sliced apples and leaned close to Evan. For a heartbeat, I saw the boy whose hand once refused to let go of mine in an ice storm. Then the grown man returned, practiced and sure. "Check beneath your plate," I said low. His mouth tilted into a smirk that didn't quite land. I straightened without waiting for a reply, turned and walked back down the hallway. The entrance smelled of wet wool and eucalyptus. My coat hung where it had always hung. The hook had a small notch on the underside I'd once carved with a box cutter to stop it from catching, and I found the notch with 2 fingers, a muscle memory I hadn't consented to. Outside December lifted a sheet of cold against my face. The porches along the street glowed unevenly, strands of bulbs sagging in soft arcs, voices floating from open windows, music, laughter, the treble of children already sugared by dessert. I turned my keys over in my pocket like a worrystone and walked to my car. The parcel remained behind twine uncut. The silence I carried with me felt heavier than the box, more demanding too. It insisted that I not drop it. Morning put a thin crust of frost on the grass along the river. I took the Centennial Trail while the mallards slit the surface with greenheads in ordinary devotion, while a pair of geese practiced a private choreography, their wings beating a metronome into the quiet. Cold air entered my lungs like a tonic that stung before it steadied. Memory warmed and chilled me by turns. Our Christmas trees were always a little crooked, no matter how we wedged them with old textbooks and quilt scraps. The ornaments never matched glitter handprints from kindergarten wooden soldiers missing faces, a tin star with one bent point. Rowan, my husband, the reliable center of the room, would hold up the paper angel Evan made in 2nd grade and say peace isn't a team jersey. He'd hang it exactly where the argument had started, and the protest would dissolve into laughter. His talent was not domination, but a quiet redirect, the kind that leaves everyone convinced they arrived at harmony themselves. A different winter surfaced the year I slipped near the duck pond by Cannon Hill. Black ice hid under powdered snow. My feet shot forward and the ground knocked the breath out of me. Evan, small enough then that his mittens looked like stuffed animals sewn to his sleeves, went louder than my pain, crying for help, as if he could outshout injury. By the time Rowan carried me inside the bungalow, Evan had wrapped me with a throw blanket patrolman proper and announced I was not allowed to die. Not ever. That boy existed. He was not a myth I'd invented to endure the present. The river lifted soft steam as the sun cleared the hospital roofline. I thought of last night's table symmetry like a sermon laurel scarf worn the way the ownership is worn generously and without apology. I thought of the soundlessness that followed Evan's sentence about the porch, how no one corrected him, how mercy requires witnesses, and the room produced none. I kept walking. There was a mug once white, with a line of tiny fir cones printed under the lip. Rowan bought it at a mountain gift shop after the 3 of us had thrown damp snowballs at each other until our hands hurt. The mug had a chip the size of an aspirin. I kept it anyway because we'd reached a point where perfect things failed to make sense. Last year, that mug vanished from the Hart House without comment, as if my mouth had never touched it, as if coffee could invent itself each morning without a vessel to hold it. I told myself someone had moved it to the back of a cupboard. I told myself a dozen explanations that all sounded like apologies I was writing to no one. The edits didn't start with the mug, though. They never do. Edits begin in the margins, lines crossed out in pencil, a stocking missing from the mantel, a nickname avoided, a light bulb swapped for a cooler hue. They compile themselves until the paragraph you loved no longer reads like yours. On one visit in spring, the gallery of frames in the hallway had changed. The photograph of Rowan and me on the rocky overlook, the one with the wind in my hair and his smile halfway between shy and proud, was gone. In its place, Evan and Laurel at a nursery on 29th Elbows curled around a tray of chrysanthemums. They looked like people who had rescued a season from laziness. It would have been a good photograph in another house, one where the swap was additive rather than subtractive. I stood there longer than I meant to, trying not to hold my breath, trying not to call the absence by its name. Later, I scrolled social media and found a square of the dining room I used to set, captioned "Impromptu Family Dinner" with 3 clapping hands and a green heart. Every plate matched, candles lit, Laurel's scarf looped with studied grace. The word family hung in the air like steam on a pane of glass, true, until a sleeve wipes it away. My name never made it under the photo. If I hadn't known the trim around that window from years of repainting it, I could have believed the scene belonged to a rental catalog. When I phoned to check on Rowan that summer, his knees had begun their quiet complaint. Laurel answered. She sounded cheerful in a way that tried to scrub the edges off everything. A spoon clinked against ceramic. I pictured her at my kitchen island using the blue mixing bowl I got at the thrift store the week Evan turned 12. "Oh, hi. Your mom's elbow deep in dough," she said, not bothering with hello, as if addressing a cousin through speaker. In the background, a male laugh rose and fell. Evan, I thought. My name on Laurel's tongue had shifted categories. I was your mom now, a courtesy designation one caller hands to another when the owner of the house is too occupied to pick up. Decisions began arriving prepackaged. The medication reminders were synced to Evan's phone instead of mine because it's streamlined that way. The insurance autopay switched accounts to simplify things. Appointments appeared on calendars. I didn't have access to the names of clinics foreign to me until after the fact. When I asked for the why of a change, the explanation came with the soothing tone reserved for people who might topple if language isn't padded. "It's just simpler if it goes through Evan," my mother said once, in that distant operator voice she uses when she wants to keep both hands clean. The words pressed against my ribs like a door that looks open and isn't. The house itself learned the new choreography. Carpets cleaned of the track lines Rowan's boots used to leave in March. The study's desk emptied of the messy drift that once held grocery lists, ticket stubs, paper clips, the sweet detritus of a shared life. Laurel's glass canisters lined the counter labeled flour, sugar, farro like transparent trophies. Evan bought stools whose seats were the color of dry wheat, and for a week the whole kitchen glowed with the self-satisfaction of a catalog. When the glow faded, what remained was efficient, tasteful, and eerily noiseless. I practiced the art of not announcing my discomfort. There's a way to object that makes you look like a vandal, and there's a kind of silence that saves your own breath for what's necessary. I wasn't sure yet which language to choose. The night air had blades in it when I left the house on Maple Row. Somewhere 2 streets over, a garage band rehearsed the same chord progression they had rehearsed for years. Comfort finds its own repetition. I turned the heat on high and drove the long way home past the field where the holiday market pitched its tents, past the library whose windows made every reader inside look like a character in a snow globe. I parked outside my building and sat for a while with my hands on the wheel, the car ticking as it cooled. Sleep came quickly and then refused to stay. Morning offered the river, and I took it as if it were a prescription I hadn't wanted but needed anyway. The geese arrowed south, then reconsidered and settled again. I breathed through the astringent cold. The trail's asphalt held frost in a pale shimmer that lifted as the sun shrugged itself over the ridge. Runners passed me, and I gave them the small nod people give in winter to say, "I see you. I'm trying too." I reviewed the puzzle without forcing the pieces, the place cards with their careful navy ink. Laurel's scarf that looked like a pretty theft. Evan's sentence about the porch and the plates. The spoon against the ceramic, my ceramic, in a hand that called me your mom while I was listening. The photographs that multiplied everywhere except where ours had been. The decisions that arrived as if delivered by a new postal route that skipped my address entirely. I didn't reach for a conclusion, but I understood this much: what is taken gently is taken all the same. It just leaves fewer bruises to point at when someone asks, "Where does it hurt?" On the bridge, a jogger's breath plumed white, then disappeared. The water below rolled slow and self-assured, folding light into itself with the patience of a ledger. I stood and watched until my fingers began to ache. Then I turned back toward town into the low sun and let a sentence form unadorned, nothing like a speech. Only a direction the smallest mark a pencil can make without snapping. I would start my own quiet work. The first change I made was small enough to be dismissed as petty. I didn't announce it to myself. I simply began taking pictures with my phone, nothing dramatic. No angles that tried to tell a story, just the square honesty of drawers and shelves. The pantry with its labeled cylinders, flour, sugar, farro, lined like obedient soldiers. the hallway where the frames had been rehung in a deliberate sequence that excluded our old summers. The coat closet where my parka, the one with the torn lining I planned to stitch every January and never did, had been nudged to the far end behind seasonal wreaths. I titled the album simply House, then turned off the location tags. It was a record, not a confession. On a rainy Tuesday, I let myself in while Laurel's car was gone and Evan's truck still sat at the shop. The entry felt newly efficient, as if air had been trained to move in narrower lanes. I slipped past the dining room and into the kitchen, opened the cupboard above the kettle, and stood still for a full breath before reaching for it, the white mug, with the ring of tiny fir cones printed under the lip. The chip was still there, an aspirin-sized bite, the porcelain freckled where glaze had failed. It fit my hand with the ease of a well-worn glove. I closed my fingers around it and felt something like equilibrium return to the bones of my wrist. I wrapped it in a dish towel, placed it inside my tote, and left the cabinet door ajar enough not to look staged. No theft, a restoration. Laurel's voice called into the house from the driveway just as I reached the back porch. She was laughing at something I couldn't hear, and my muscles found the same calm stillness they'd learned years ago when Evan was a toddler asleep on my shoulder. Do not jostle the situation you intend to preserve. I stepped into the drizzle, pulled the screen door to without clicking the latch, and felt the weight of the mug alter the swing of the bag against my hip. It was a small gravity, but it held. When Rowan died in early November, the neighborhood behaved the way neighborhoods do. The Hartleys brought a lasagna in a pan they told me not to wash. The high school librarian left scones and a note with too many hearts. A man I didn't recognize shoveled the sidewalk and waved from a distance, as if noise might jar the quiet Rowan had always kept. We held the gathering at Maple Row because people needed a location to deposit their casseroles and condolences, and Laurel had volunteered with a brightness that bordered on managerial. She greeted every guest at the door in a black sheath I recognized as mine from a winter funeral 2 decades back. She wore it well. That wasn't the point. I stood by the coat rack with my hand resting on the sleeve of a tweed jacket that still carried Rowan's tobacco leaf smell. Laurel poured warm cider into glass tumblers and told quick, palatable stories. Rowan always said the secret to a good day was starting before daylight. She laughed and the circle around her softened in relief. It was the kind of recollection people prefer in rooms heavy with casseroles, tidy, repeatable, not demanding rebuttal. Evan moved like a conductor at the center, collecting people, assigning chairs, answering questions about appointments and banks, in the same tone he used to use coaching fifth graders on which base to throw to. He didn't brag. He believed he was telling the architecture of care. I felt the correction rise in me. No, that day started differently. It started with him swearing at the snowblower, then let it subside. I wasn't there to referee the version. The house was doing its own editing, and the crowd preferred footnotes to disagreement. I helped a cousin carry out a tray and kept my mouth from writing checks my future self would have to cash. That night, when the last lid was snapped back onto the last plastic container and the dishwasher pushed its watery ache through the pipes, I sat at my apartment table and opened a notebook. I wrote down what had moved Frame's linens, the light fixture in the hallway. I wrote down what had disappeared Rowan's stiff leather tool belt from the mudroom, his battered Red Sox cap with the sweat salt halo, the index card, with the names of the birds he'd learned to recognize at the feeder. I wasn't building an argument, I was building an inventory. Sometimes the only proof that something happened is that you write it down and the ink stays. A week later, I returned to Maple Row while Evan was at the auto shop, and Laurel had a calendar reminder titled Pilates Prep. The rooms felt staged in a way that wasn't dishonest so much as tidy beyond use. The study at the back, though the room Rowan called the shop, even though it didn't contain machines, retained its old atmosphere. The air held the faint iron tang of oil and the dusty sweetness of paper. His recliner sagged in the middle where daily weight had made a bowl. The small wind-up clock that had refused to keep proper time for years ticked 12 minutes slow, as if it had chosen a more forgiving speed than the rest of the house. Against the far wall stood a narrow cabinet with a brass handle. I had seen Rowan open it 100 times with a practiced turn that looked like nothing. I had never asked what lived inside. Marriage is full of benign mysteries you don't interrogate because the person is there to embody them. Now the person was not. Memory tugged on an older thread of winter when Evan was in 8th grade and the furnace rattled like a truck. Rowan had pulled down a paperback from the shelf, a Sand County almanac. Its spine cracked into pale ridges and slid a sliver of metal into the gap where the glue had loosened. Spare, he'd said when I lifted an eyebrow. Not paranoid. Prepared. He tucked the book back and we went out to the hardware store for filters. My fingers found the same book now, with a certainty that felt borrowed from someone more decisive than I am. The cover rasped under my thumb. I tilted it and shook gently, and a small brass key slid into my palm with the obedience of a trained dog. I stared at it for a long heartbeat, as if it might answer a question I hadn't articulated, then crossed to the cabinet and set the bid into the lock. It resisted not with drama, but with the steady refusal of something that remembers last being opened by a familiar wrist. I turned again firmer, and it gave, with a sigh I felt in my shoulder. Inside sat a metal strongbox the size of a thick cookbook. The lid had a keyhole twin to the cabinets. When the second lock clicked, the sound seemed too loud for the quiet room. I glanced toward the hallway, listened, and lifted the lid. Papers folded. An envelope with my name in Rowan's square handwriting, patient and unhurried, as if he had imagined opening it beside me, not alone. Beneath a sheaf with a blue notary stamp catching the light like a soft coin. I sat at the desk and breathed once, twice, the way you do before lowering yourself into cold water. Then I unfolded. The document refused to change under my eyes, no matter how many times I reread the opening lines. Rowan's will, executed last spring with 2 witnesses' names I recognized from the neighborhood, properly notarized. The language was not poetic. It did not need to be. It named me personal representative. It named me beneficiary of the house, the accounts, the small parcel of dry meadow out near Pine Creek he'd kept because leaving it made him lonelier than keeping it. Evan's name did not appear in the column that mattered. Laurel's did not appear at all. There were provisions, of course, bequests of books and rods, and the old yellow canoe, but they flowed from the central fact, with the logic of a river around rocks. I set the will aside and opened the envelope with my name. Rowan did not write letters. He left notes back late, left eggs warming, don't forget the trash, that read like a shorthand, only we could translate. The letter was 3 sentences in his staunch print. Marin, you stayed. You do the unpretty work no one claps for. I see it. This house needs your steady hands. Let what's written carry weight where words fail. I didn't cry. I thought I might someday. I held the paper flat with both palms and let the clarity do what clarity does. I took out my phone, opened the scan app I had used once for insurance paperwork, and slid the lens over each page until the image snapped crisp. I saved them to a folder named with nothing that meant anything to anyone but me records. I did not email them to myself. I did not text them to a friend to make the reality sturdier in the presence of another pair of eyes. I stacked the papers exactly as I found them, slid them back into their envelope, set the envelope into the strongbox, and closed the lid until the latch found itself. The room felt different with the box closed, not lighter, but correctly weighted like a shelf after you've moved the heavy books to where the studs actually are. I returned the key to my palm, shut the cabinet, and turned the lock until the brass snugged into place. The wind-up clock ticked its forgiving minutes. Outside the study, the newer portions of the house hummed with the efficient quiet Laurel preferred the refrigerator's low breath, the heater clicking itself into a steadier hum. I stood for a while with my hand on the back of Rowan's chair, feeling the valley, his absence left in the cushion. I thought of Evan's certainty at the memorial, the way he mapped responsibility onto authority, as if one proved the other, the way Laurel made herself native to rooms by narrating them. I thought of the mug tucked into my tote, on the kitchen stool, its chip, the ring of fir cones pressed against cloth. I let the thoughts move without lining them up into a formation that would obligate me to an argument. Before I left, I checked the window latch, the one Rowan had always insisted stuck in February, and smiled when it caught on the first try. I closed the study door behind me, felt the small click seat itself into the frame, and carried both keys in my pocket, the one that opened the cabinet and the one that had always opened the front door. Both were warm now from my palm, as if metal could learn the temperature of a decision. Rain had stopped. The sky over the street showed a gray that would by mid-afternoon learn to be brightness. I let myself out and locked the door by habit, then stood on the porch long enough to hear the ordinary city noises collect again. Someone dragging a recycling bin, a dog objecting to an invisible offense, a distant bus coughing into motion. I slid the smaller key against the larger on my keyring until the teeth made a soft, exact music. Then I stepped down to the walk and turned toward the car, the tote bumping my hip in rhythm with my strides, the weight of the mug a small, loyal echo. I did not look back at the window of the study. There was no need. The house knew what it held. So did I. I didn't announce the next steps to myself any more than I had announced the photographs or the mug. I made tea in the fir cone cup, sat at the kitchen table with the window fogging in a soft oval, and read the county website the way I used to read appliance manuals, slowly underlining in my mind. The language was spare. If a will was properly executed, witnessed, notarized, and informal filing could move like ordinary paperwork, notices, appointment of a personal representative, inventory accountings. Nothing theatrical. The steadiness steadied me. A neighbor at the market had once mentioned a lawyer she trusted for estates, a woman named Kendra Lee with a small office near the courthouse. I called and left a message that said only what was necessary. She returned it herself the next morning, voice unhurried, questions clear. I described the document. She asked about witnesses, dates, stamps. When I finished, she said, "That instrument is sound. Bring copies. We'll keep to the simple path." We set a time for the first week of January. I opened a plain manila folder and began slipping pages into sleeves. The scanned will, a list of items that had gone missing or relocated, the dates of calls not returned, the photograph of the hallway before the frames were changed. I included nothing I couldn't justify to a stranger. I printed each scan on the library's third-floor copier. Its whir, a low civic music I hadn't realized I'd missed. In blue ink, small and right-leaning, I wrote records on the tab. Snow found the city in a careful way, sifting rather than falling. By evening, the sidewalks were a chalky script underfoot. I tied a new length of linen twine around a small box, the same cottony brown paper I had used since Evan was little because tape never looked as honest. Inside the box went the clean print of Rowan's will with the notary seal reproduced in gray, the letter with his blocky meridian at the top, and a photograph I had kept in a different book for years, a picture of Rowan and me shoulder to shoulder at the gate to Pine Creek, meadow cheeks pink and ridiculous in January light, both of us smiling as if we had discovered a private holiday. I didn't add a note. Notes explain, copies simply travel. Christmas Eve brightened Maple Row in patches, some porches giddy with light, some underdressed, some pretending to be ordinary Tuesday. I parked under the same elm that had buckled the curb since Evan was 13 and climbed the 3 steps to the front door. I didn't knock. The sound of chairs and glass rose to meet me, the smell of cloves and roast fat, the theater of candles, the satin hush of Laurel's voice doing air traffic control without breaking a smile. The dining room had arranged itself as if it had rehearsed without me and learned its marks. The table ran long and white, a pale river set with narrow tapers. Place cards in navy script formed a neat geography around the platters. My name was not part of the map. Evan occupied the head position as comfortably as if it had grown for him. He had the practiced ease of a man who believes the room is better for his certainty. Laurel sat at his right, a pale dress that borrowed light, the moss-green scarf entering the conversation on its own. I carried the box to the center of the table and placed it near the bowl of roasted pears. It made the plain sound of cardboard on wood. I leaned toward Evan. "Check under your plate," I said, tone mild enough to pass. He gave me the half-smile he saves for managing a neighbor's stray complaint. I straightened before anyone could convert the moment into a performance. Forks paused. A hush bent the air. I walked the length of the hallway with my coat over one arm, the house's newer quiet pressing at my back. Near the entry coats hung in disciplined rows. My hook held nothing of mine but remembered my hand anyway. The notch on the underside caught the skin at my thumb, the way it always had. I slid into my sleeves. Around me the sounds rearranged. Someone cleared a throat, a chair leg ticked on wood, a wine glass adjusted itself on a coaster. From the doorway I could see only the far edge of the table. A candle threw a long line of light across the runner. Evan lifted his plate by 2 fingers with the restrained curiosity of someone who expects a prank and is prepared to forgive it. The slender brass key I had taped there with a single cross of masking tape dangled and swung, catching the light like a small amused bell. Laurel's mouth opened a fraction. Someone said, "What's that too brightly?" The twine knot on the box faced Evan like a calm instruction. I descended the 3 steps into the bare December evening before anyone asked me a question I would not answer. The cold took my lungs the way laughter does when you have almost forgotten how to make the sound. Across the street, the church clock began to count the hour, each tone lifting and settling as if it were alive. I crossed to my car, set both hands on the roof to steady the key in the dark, and paused long enough for the ringing to finish. It was not the first time I had left a room, so it could hear itself. Inside that room, the box lid would lift. The gray copy of the will would show its stamp with bureaucratic beauty. Rowan's letter would sit under Evan's hand's stubborn print, spelling out what spoken language had failed to land. The photograph would be there as if to insist that love makes a better witness than memory. And under the plate, the small, honest key, the ordinary brass that opened the cabinet he had never noticed, would swing against his knuckles with the exact weight of proof. Wind combed the bare branches into a soft rattle. I started the car and let the heater cough itself into warmth. My hands shook not with fear, but with the aftershock of a choice correctly sized to its moment. The street ahead lay in clean strips where tires had pressed the snow into a darker script. I took the long route again past the bandstand, where kids skidded on a slick of ice, past the dark windows of the branch library, past the diner where somebody in a red paper hat lifted a pot of coffee as if lifting a flag. At home, the apartment heated in slow degrees. I set the fir cone mug on the counter and did nothing for a while. There is a very particular quiet that arrives after you have done the exact thing you meant to do. It does not congratulate. It sets the glassware back on the shelf of your ribs one by one without nicking the edges. I let it do that work. My phone face down kept its silence. I wiped the damp from the window with the sleeve of my sweater and watched the parking lot lamp thresh snow into a loose halo. In the next building, a television flickered through blue and then through gold. Somewhere a dog voiced its honest opinion about being asked to go outside. I opened the manila folder not to add anything but to feel the weight of its pages unify. Paper has a way of becoming a single object once it decides it belongs together. When the kettle clicked off, I poured water through the leaves and breathed the steam. The chip on the mug found my lip the way a map finds a border. I thought of Rowan's square handwriting, the EKG steadiness of it, the way he refused flourish even when a word tempted him. I thought of Evan at the head of the table, the plate in his hand, the key hanging like a pause in a sentence. I let the images sit beside one another without arguing for their order. Snow eased. The lamplight thinned. Somewhere a plow talked itself down the boulevard in low, stubborn pushes. I turned out the kitchen light and let the apartment keep its small brightnesses under cabinet glow, the green dot, on the router, the small red eye of the heater. I slid the folder back into the drawer with the spare batteries and the pack of rubber bands, and I stood for a time with my hand on the wood, feeling the grain under my palm. The river tomorrow would wear a skin of light. For now, the night carried its own kind of order. I rinsed the cup, left it to dry on the towel, and went to bed with the steadiness of someone who has placed the right object in the right room and closed the door without ceremony. In the morning, my phone behaved like a door someone kept testing without committing to entry. A soft rattle of alerts stacked themselves on the lock screen. Green bubbles from Evan, a voice memo from a cousin whose name I hadn't seen since the last 4th of July. A voicemail icon from the church office. I turned the phone face down on the table and watched the steam lift from the kettle, the little tornado inside the spout, the room counting its own breaths. When I finally touched the screen, I read without composing answers. Laurel, first light punctuation, generous exclamation marks, the tone of a cheery receptionist. We were all surprised by your gesture. Let's not make this bigger than it needs to be. The ellipsis worked like a pair of tweezers, lifting the fact without saying its name. Evan's message came longer, trying on different speeds. We can work through misunderstandings. Then Dad wouldn't want bitterness to eat this family. He didn't write will. He didn't write letter. He wrote we as if the pronoun could bind the edges. The cousins sang the same notes in different keys. Families are messy. Love wins out. Holidays are hard. The pastor, to his credit, left a brief message that acknowledged loss and offered soup. I texted him thanks and left the rest unanswered. I opened the fur cone mug's cabinet with a thrum of ordinary pleasure and poured coffee the chip, finding my lip as if it had been sized there. Silence properly used isn't a wall. It's a field left fallow. It prepares the ground for what actually grows. By afternoon, the phone had learned my preference and dimmed its thirst for attention. The sky went the soft color of old paper. I pulled on boots and walked the block, my breath arriving in puffs that stitched themselves away. A neighbor waved from her porch where a wreath hung slightly threshold crooked in a way that looked human rather than careless. When I came back, the voicemail icon had added a quiet red badge. I listened while standing by the sink. Hey, Marin. It's me. Evan. A pause long enough to be deliberate. I think we've gotten crosswise. I don't want this to be he searched for a noun he could live with a freeze. We'll talk after the weekend. His voice had the steadiness he uses when directing traffic in a parking lot after a school event. The steadiness had always moved people more than any apology could. I powered the phone down and placed it atop the manila folder, a small paperweight in reverse. I put the kettle on again and set a pen next to the folder without opening it. There are times when you keep your hands still so your mind does the moving. The apartment held its small, faithful lights, the under-cabinet glow, the green dot of the router like ships at anchor. When the tea was ready, I turned the phone face down once more and let the evening fill without the scaffolding of conversation. The business week returned indifferent and merciful. Cars moved in their old lanes. The river wore its thin skin of ice where the current ran slower. On Wednesday at the nursery office off Division, where I work 3 days a week, my receptionist Lila poked her head into the break room with an expression that mixed apology with caution. There's a gentleman at the desk asking for you, she said. Careful with gentlemen the way you're careful handling glass. He doesn't look like someone you want to see. I didn't ask who. Lila had already done the interpreting. Please tell him I'm not available and to email the office address, I said. The words arranged themselves into a polite barricade. They were the kind of sentence that protects both parties from unnecessary harm. Lila nodded, grateful for the clarity, and returned to the front. 20 minutes later, she came back, exhaled, and shook her head once. He left, she said. Didn't take the card. The relief in her voice was practical, not gossip courteous. She had seen a shape she recognized and moved me around it the way you move a pot away from the edge before it falls. January arrived with its clean arithmetic days that start on time bills that apologize in numbers rather than words. I kept my appointment with Kendra Lee at 10 on a Tuesday, the courthouse block, still holding last week's ice in the seams of its steps. Her office was on the second floor of a building that had once wanted to be a bank and now wanted to be efficient. The waiting room held 3 chairs with polite backs and a side table of magazines that meant generally well. I didn't sit. Kendra came out exactly when the clock clicked to the hour, with a file under her arm and a handshake that felt like a stable surface. We took a seat at a narrow table by a window with a view of the bus stop. Kendra spoke the way people write who were loved by their English teachers, no filler, no obfuscation clauses that land. She placed the copy of Rowan's will where the light liked it, flipped each page, touched the notary stamp with a fingertip as if it were a bell that would ring if pressed too hard. Witnessed, notarized. No codicils, no defects on the face, she said. An informal probate is appropriate. We file a petition naming you as personal representative. We lodge the will and the court issues letters. We then notice interested persons. We proceed with inventory. We keep the ledger even. She didn't smile when she said even. She meant it. I breathed more deeply because someone else knew the measurements. Do I change the locks? I asked a question that had walked the border of my mind for days. Kendra shook her head. Not unless there's waste damage or refusal to surrender when asked. Start by requesting cooperation for inventory. Document everything. If they obstruct, we escalate exactly as far as necessary and no further. She slid a single sheet across the table. Also, don't let this turn into theater. The law is already on stage. Let it carry the dialogue. We filled out forms that had lines for things I recognized, name, address, and lines for things that felt like a certain kind of math, domicile, testamentary intent, self-proved. I initialed where the arrows invited me. Kendra clipped the packet into a folder with a small satisfying sound like a good book closing. We'll file this afternoon, she said. The clerk here is sensible. Expect letters by early next week. She paused. You did the hard part already. You found the paper and didn't make noise. She said it without flattery. She was naming the tool we were using. Outside, the air wore the thin brightness of winter noon. I stood at the courthouse steps a moment longer than I needed to and watched a man help a woman with a stroller negotiate the final icy patch. When the stroller hit dry concrete, all 3 of them, that is the man, the woman and the child inside the stroller with its knitted hat, seemed to breathe the same breath. I walked to my car, unlocked it, and sat with my hands on the wheel until the heater found its courage. 2 days later, Kendra texted a photograph of a stamped filing with the kind of caption a lawyer allows herself. Filed. Receipt attached. Letters pending. The word letters in that context meant authority proof printed on cream paper with a raised seal. The word had always meant connection to me, the distance bridging sort. It could now be both. I addressed envelopes at my kitchen table, one to Evan and one to Laurel at Maple Row, one to Rowan's sister in Walla Walla, one to the utility company, because form demanded it. The notices explained without flourish what had been filed and what the statute required next. I chose stamps with the winter berries and pressed them on with the heel of my thumb. In the morning, I slid each envelope through the slot at the post office and listened for the small, reliable thunk. The responses arrived with a family resemblance. A text from Evan, I got the notice. I didn't know about the arrangements. Let me know what you need for the inventory. A message from Rowan's sister with a softer edge. I'm relieved he did the right paperwork. Tell me when you want me to walk the garage with you. I remember where he kept the auger bits. Laurel stayed silent, which I realized was not the same thing as staying out of the way. The river began to shrug its ice off the edges by the 3rd week of January. The trail smelled briefly of tin and then of wet earth. I walked my usual 1.5 miles and headed back with a palmful of cold air. On the mailbox stood a neighbor's text, saw something you'll like. The photo, when it arrived seconds later, showed the Maple Row shed. The pegboard above the workbench and thumbtacked slightly crooked at eye level the photograph of Rowan and me at the gate to Pine Creek Meadow. Not in the living room. Not curated for guests. It looked truer there, as if it had waited for that wall. On the workbench, someone had set a small pile, measuring tape pencil nub of folded rag things that looked like use, rather than display. I stared until the damp on my glove cooled my fingers. It felt like a sentence correctly punctuated, an object returned to its subject. I typed, "Thank you" back and didn't add explanation. That night, a new text from Evan arrived. I'll cooperate. When can we meet for the inventory? There was no apology in it, which was a relief. Apology invites a choreography I didn't want to rehearse. Cooperation is an action verb. I proposed a date with 3 hours blocked. He answered fine. The single word had the right size. We did the inventory the following Saturday with Kendra's checklist printed on a clipboard and a pencil whose eraser had not been used. Evan met me at the door with a face composed for ordinary work. Laurel wasn't there. I didn't ask where. The study greeted us with its unchanged climate, the 12-minute slow clock, the clean bowl of the chair. We named objects and wrote them down. I read labels aloud. Evan opened drawers. The pencil traveled. When we found the box of hand-tied flies Rowan had made in 1994, Evan paused, held one up to the window, and let the light find the patient feathers. "He taught me this one," he said, voice small with remembering. "Woolly bugger." We both laughed at the name because it had always asked for laughter. We moved through the house room by room. In the kitchen, Evan pointed to Laurel's glass canisters and said, "We'll take those along when we go." He said it matter-of-factly, not staking ground, just naming what he expected to carry. I wrote canisters glass labeled and didn't annotate. He asked at the doorway to the hallway frames, "Do you want the old picture put back?" I looked at the empty space where our overlook photograph had hung and felt not yearning, but a steady absence that had finished its work. "Leave the wall for now," I said. The pencil made its small cross and moved on. At the end, when the clipboard held our afternoon, we signed, the page's inventory begun, to be continued date/time, and stacked them on the desk. Evan cleared his throat. I didn't think he started, then let the claws go. I thought handling things meant I knew the shape of them. He wasn't offering a plea. He was naming the sensation when a map proves to be of a different county than the one you're driving through. I nodded once. "Thank you for today," I said. The words did their work and stopped. Kendra filed the initial inventory on Monday. A week later, the letters arrived on cream paper that held its curl. I ran a finger over the raised seal and felt a small, unexpected calm. Authority on paper isn't a personality trait. It's a tool that makes certain sentences unnecessary. I put the letters into the manila folder, slid the folder into the drawer beside the spare batteries, and closed it with the same care I brought to rinsing the mug. January ended the way January ends. Sidewalk sanded air clear enough to pretend you could drink it, evenings that lift toward a slightly later blue. I sat at my table with a legal pad and shaped the next weeks into columns, repairs bids, dates, not as edicts, but as roads to be walked. I called a contractor to look at the lintel cracking above the porch, and when he said he could come Thursday, the calendar absorbed the fact without comment. I sent Evan the dates for the next inventory session. He replied with a thumbs up, which on him is close to graceful. I poured coffee into the fur cone mug and stood at the window. The parking lot had learned the geometry of melt dark V's where tires had argued with snow and won. On the counter lay the photograph of the shed. My neighbor had sent thumbtacks like small stars, our faces a little ridiculous in the winter light. I didn't frame it. I let it be itself on the wood, a plain square that told the truth without dressing up. The house on Maple Row would require more lists, more walking, room-to-room naming, what stays and what goes, more calls to the kinds of numbers that answer on the third ring and ask how you spell the street. None of that required a speech. The folder in the drawer waited the day properly. The river had taken back its margins and moved without showing off. The mug chipped, did its job, and kept my hands warm. I set the cup down and opened the window half an inch to let the clean air find the room. Somewhere a church bell worked its way through the hour, one note at a time, not hurrying. I breathed with it, the apartment holding its small brightnesses the way a good vessel holds its shape. The work ahead had the calm of honest labor. The house would be tended, the record would be kept, and in the quiet room of my chest, something unknotted and lay flat. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.